you pay a CEO $30 million, it's not clear that CEO is giving you $30 million in additional wealth. Somewhere around 30% of the workforce was in unions back in the 50s. Now we're down to around 10%, and in the private sector, just around 6%. Pay attention to, what costs are, what living standards are, what other wages are, and you do it in steps, so you don't have huge jumps, in one year. I think there's a lot of room to raise the minimum wage.
We are pleased to be joined by Dean Baker, an economist with a PhD from the University of Michigan, co-founder of the Center for Economic and Policy Research, and an author of multiple books, one of which, Rigged, we'll be talking about a bit today. I want to first thank you for taking the time to speak with us.
Sure, Brandon. Thanks a lot for having me on.
Yeah, anytime. The pleasure's all ours. So I want to start with trade. Could you talk about the ways we see it play into economic imbalances? I know this is one of the key, pillars or topics you speak about in your book, Rigged. How are trade agreements or trade policy structured in a way that favors capital rather than labor?
Our trade policy is designed to directly put U.S. manufacturing workers in competition with low-paid workers in the developing world. And that has the predicted effect and actual effect of costing jobs for manufacturing workers and putting downward pressure on the wages for those who keep their jobs. And we saw that. I mean, there was massive job loss in manufacturing 2000 to 2010, and we didn't see anything like that before or since. And that was because the trade deficit exploded in that period. And since then, it stabilized, actually came down some. But people often refer to that as free trade. And what always annoys me is that we didn't have free trade in things like doctor services, dentist services. In fact, if anything, we made restrictions tighter on foreign doctors, foreign dentists practicing in the United States. And that's trade. I mean, I've had arguments with economists that go, that's immigration. I go, no, actually, I have plenty of doctors that come here from other countries. Some of them are driving cabs. They aren't allowed to practice medicine here. That's trade. So I focus on this with prescription drugs because that is the biggest area for this. But it's also, this is people's health, people's lives. And we'll spend over $700 billion this year on pharmaceuticals, prescriptions and other pharmaceutical products. We'd probably spend about $100 billion if we had a free market there. But we have patent monopolies, related protection. So we spend a huge amount of money. We make drugs very expensive, and then we run around scratching our heads. How can we bring drug prices down? Don't give them a monopoly. They'd be cheap.
Yeah, and another thing that I know your book goes into that I wanted to have you discuss was how corporate pay and even how corporations are structured in a way to keep income flowing upwards as well. Could you kind of explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so there's a lot of people who focus on corporate profits. It's certainly an appropriate thing to focus on, and corporate profits have been expanding as a share of national income over the last 20, 25 years. But most of the upward redistribution that we've seen since the 70s was actually within the wage distribution. It was to high-end earners. So I mentioned Bill Gates. Of course, he was also a huge shareholder in Microsoft, but he also made a lot of money by virtue of the fact he's a very creative guy. He did a lot with Microsoft developing their software. And you have a lot of other people in that boat. But when it comes to the corporate structure, what I've pointed out, and I certainly shouldn't say I'm alone in doing this, that we have an awful lot of money that flows to top executives. So we have CEOs that it's very common get 20, 30, $40 million salaries. Elon Musk, I know, pocketed something like 25 billion. That's a little more complicated because he's far and away the leading shareholder of Tesla. So it's not simply as a CEO, it's more complicated. But even taking him out of the equation, you have any number of CEOs that get tens of millions and sometimes over $100 million as their pay package. And the point that I've made in my writing is that it's not clear that this is maximizing profit for corporations. And it's not as though I think that's the ultimate good. But the point here is when you pay a CEO $30 million, it's not clear that CEO is giving you $30 million in additional wealth compared to replacement CEO who might be willing to work for $5 million. And the reason we get such high pay for our CEOs is we have a very corrupt corporate governance structure where the CEOs have very large input into selecting the board of directors that determine their pay. If a board member is nominated for re-election to the board by the other members of the board, they win over 99% of the time. So it's virtually a sure ticket. So if you've kept your other board members happy, you're friendly with them, they like you, they nominate you, you get to stay on the board. And to my view, what that means is that there's very little incentive for a member of the board to raise a question like, well, couldn't we pay our CEO less? Couldn't we get a CEO who's just as good and pay them half as much? That would affect the pay structure, on down. So the next layer, if your CEO is getting 5 million, your next level is maybe getting 3 million, and you get to the third echelon, maybe they're cracking 1 million, maybe not. And, this also spills over to other sectors. It's become common now for a president of a major university. They might get 2, 3 million, even more. So it affects pay structures throughout the economy. So I think it's important to point out this is a corporate governance structure. And again, that's determined by the government. This wasn't, God didn't give us corporate governance structures. We set the law sets them, we could set them differently. In the US, they're very, very friendly to top management. In Europe and in Japan, East Asia, much less so. And as a result of that, they get considerably lower pay, which means, less inequality. So again, I think that's a really important point that I think is underappreciated.
I'm curious because when you talk about like the boards, obviously these people, like if they're directing the profits, they're going to want to benefit themselves more so than the workers. And I think something, to help tip the scale there is like unions and the labor movement. What role do you think the weakening of the labor movement through policy or rhetoric plays in allowing this sort of imbalance?
Yeah, the labor movement has been a major counterforce against capital, against inequality, really forever. And that applies here and everywhere else throughout the industrialized world. And it's been hugely weakened over the last 40, 50 years. So if we go back to the 50s, labor peaked as somewhere around 30%. I should check the exact number, but somewhere around 30% of the workforce was in unions back in the 50s. Now we're down to around 10%, and in the private sector, just around 6%. So labor is much less effective as a counterforce that's both in terms of maintaining wages for workers, keeping an eye on CEOs. Again, they're not in much position to do that now, but in years past, when you could imagine more powerful unions, they could try to police CEO pay. They don't have a direct role in that. It's not, if you looked at mandatory bargaining, that's not one of the things that in principle unions could bargain over. But on the other hand, they could say something. And even if that's not something that they could directly bargain over, they could certainly influence it. And today you see increased monopoly power in many sectors, but the workers aren't in a position to bargain for their share. So that's, I think, part of the story. And again, I haven't tried to analyze it closely enough to say how large a part, but at least part of the story of the shift from wages to profits. The other point I'll say about the weakening of labor unions is labor unions were a very important political counterforce to capital. You have, Elon Musk, just to take the most visible example, I forget what he ended up spending, those 200 to 300 million supporting Donald Trump's presidential campaign. So there's basically no limit what these very, very rich people could spend on their candidates. And with labor much, much weaker than it was, say, 4 or 5 decades ago, it's much less effective as a counterforce. So that's a very, very big deal. And, again, to my view, very unfortunate.
Yeah, yeah. And if I remember correctly, Elon spent 270 million, which I'm sure plenty of people watching couldn't spend $270, let alone 270 million. That's pretty insane when you think about it. I'm curious what you think is at the center of this imbalance, which if this is, I don't know, maybe a tough question, but if there was like, if we were going to begin to try to peel back this, where do you think we would have to start?
What I've been focusing on, and I really wish more people would pay attention to it, is the media. Because again, you have media, and obviously you have like your Foxes, your Sinclairs that are owned by rich people and quite explicitly are pushing very right-wing agendas, so we don't have to really argue over that. I don't think we have to argue over it. Fox News is pretty Republican, pretty right-wing. But even the more mainstream outlets, and this is even prior to Trump, it's obviously getting worse with Trump, where you have CBS News basically, saying, "Oh yes, Mr. Trump will do what you want." I'm referring here to their settlement of this defamation suit, which is utterly absurd. I don't know anyone who knows anything about the law who thought that lawsuit made any sense whatsoever. But rather than fighting out in court and surely having it dismissed, CBS said, yeah, we'll pay you, I think it was 15 million. And then they're agreeing to let Trump appoint a supervisor to oversee their content. I mean, just crazy, crazy stuff. But again, even prior to that, yeah, I would say the media did have a very strong, I'll say, business bias. It wasn't necessarily as right wing as what it might get to be, or certainly what Fox is already. But it had a clear bias. And I think we have to try and counter that. What I've looked to do, and my reason for saying this, focusing on this, is having some sort of individual tax credit or voucher, whatever you might call it, where people would have, let's say, $100 to support news outlet of their choice. And what I like about this so much is that it can, I mean, if I had my way, it'd be done nationally. We'd all have $100 and we could give it to whatever news organization we liked. But it could be done at the state level, it could be done at the local level. And there's currently the candidate who's actually the leading contender for the mayoral race in Seattle. She won the primary with a majority of the vote. That this is an open primary, so everyone competes in that. So she's the leading contender to be the mayor, Katie Wilson. She's been a big backer of this.
What are your thoughts on the minimum wage? Can we raise it? Would it be too dangerous to raise it? What are your thoughts with that?
Yeah, this is an area where there's been great research over the last 3 decades. It's really changed how everyone, including myself, have thought about the minimum wage. If you go back to the 1980s, I remember the New York Times had an editorial that said the best minimum wage, zero. And I'm picking on the New York Times because, they're left of center. They aren't any sort of radical paper. They're definitely left of center. And then very much reflected kind of mainstream thinking in the economics profession. Now, since then, there's been a lot of research on the minimum wage that shows we actually have a lot of room to raise it, which is not just at the federal level, but at the state and local level, which again, I really thought we didn't have much room to raise it at the state and particularly the local level. But we've seen a lot of cities, Seattle, San Francisco, New York City, they've raised their wages well above the national minimum wage and even above the minimum wage in the rest of the state. And all the evidence, there may be some exceptions, but I've seen a number of studies, and I think if there were, any very credible study showing the opposite, I've heard of it. Basically, all the evidence has shown it's had very little effect on employment. So to my view, I think it's a great tool for raising incomes for people at the bottom. Now, just to be clear, I don't think we can make it whatever we want. I might like everyone to be able to get at least $30 an hour. I would like everyone to be able to get, but I think if we just said tomorrow, okay, we're going to minimum wage, we'd have a lot of unemployment. But if you're careful about it, you pay attention to, what costs are, what living standards are, what other wages are, and you do it in steps so you don't have huge jumps, in one year. I think there's a lot of room to raise the minimum wage, and the minimum wage increases that we've seen all at the state and local level. I mean, we haven't increased the federal minimum wage. Last time we passed a law on that was 07, with the last increase hitting in 09. But that there's a lot of room there, and I'd hope if we ever do get Democrat back in the White House, Democratic Congress, I'd hope there'd be an increase in the national minimum wage because it'd make a big difference to a lot of people.
Yeah, because meanwhile in my state and city, the minimum wage is still $7.25, so that's always nice.